I killed the music at my daughter's grand opening, hijacked the screens, and handed her a cease and desist with her mother's handwriting on the letterhead, because 3 weeks earlier I trademarked my wife's name and gave it away. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. My name is Harold Dunn. I am 71, a grandfather of 2, and it has taken me a full year of widowhood to admit that grief is a quiet room where some people hear whispers and other people hear cash registers. My wife, Nora, had a handwriting you could taste. Her N looped at the top as if it had been hung to dry on a clothesline, the tail of the letter flicking like a fish. She drew cherry pits like little moons and pears the color of dusk. She had a way of tapping a label onto a jar that felt like a blessing. I used to tease that her pantry looked like an apothecary in a town where nothing ever went wrong. Her garden was a rectangle of kindness behind our clapboard house. Raised beds made from planks I salvaged from a school renovation, corrugated metal water troughs reimagined as planters, one lopsided trellis that leaned like it was listening. Children brought her jars of bugs for identification and left with cuttings of mint and a story about companion planting. Teenagers came for her chili oil and stayed to learn about blanching. I always said her garden was ordered chaos. She would tilt her head and correct me, orderly chaos. The difference is intention. On our 40th anniversary, we leaned against the greenhouse glass and watched bees do their wild dance that looks like a fight until you know it is a map. I said, "This will outlast us," meaning the trellis, the stubborn rosemary, the neighbor children with shoelaces untied. She put her hand through the crook of my arm and said, "Then we must be careful where we place our hands." When Nora died, the house went mute for a while. The hum of the refrigerator sounded like an accusation. I ate food that did not require a plate. People came and left pies heavy with pity. They said her name like they were placing a fragile thing on a high shelf. After the first few Mondays of listless soup, my daughter, Fiona, arrived with 2-sided printouts and a voice like a newscaster who has learned how to make grief sound like opportunity. She had a mood board, which in my day was a wall. Color palettes in creams and fern greens. Photographs of aprons tied on bodies that do not bend. Phrases like heritage story, scalable process, cottage aesthetic, direct to consumer. She said, "Mom deserves a brand." She said we could honor her and grow. She said we could meet people where they live. She said subscriptions, seasonal boxes, a spice line. We can start with the jams, she said. Nora's, simple, clean, obvious. It already has traction in the neighborhood. I thought of traction and saw a tire rut through damp soil. I saw a heel flattening the edge of a bed where carrots were deciding whether to believe in themselves. 2 things, I told her. Your mother was clear. The house and garden are not to be flipped, scraped, or cut into parcels, they are to feed people as they are. And her recipes are not to be tinkered with or cheapened. She wrote that on a post-it I framed, no shortcuts. Fiona nodded quickly, the way people nod when they are preparing a counterargument. We will not cut, she said. We will protect and amplify. You will sit on a family advisory council. Advisory, I repeated, feeling that word the way you feel a coin and know it is fake by the temperature. What is the council's job? To advise. And whose job is it to decide? The smile she gave me belonged to a person who has never had to scrub a pan. Dad, she said, drawing the word out into a blanket. Trust me. A week later, my son-in-law sent over what he called a friendly draft. He described it as a formality to get the ball rolling. The document was the weight of a small dog. It wanted my signature under clauses that would parcel out my wife like a field. They wanted the name, the likeness, the little basil drawing she had put on her herb vinegars, the phrase orderly chaos, the very looping in, what lawyers call the trade dress. I read enough to learn that my advisory council was a triangle with my daughter, her husband, and their accountant at the points. My name was not a point. I was a line men could draw wherever it helped them. I made tea in the chipped blue kettle I had been meaning to replace for 20 years and stood at the sink thinking about the day Nora scorched fig jam and instead of scrapping the pot she laughed and stirred in balsamic and declared it sophisticated. I thought about the night we argued because I had sold a shelf of cutting boards for half their worth to a man who looked like the kind of man who buys cheap. She had taken my hand and said, "You must not make it easier for the wrong people." My hand still holds the shape of that sentence. That night I pulled the studio door open knowing I was doing something that in a marriage would have been labeled trespass but in a kitchen is called necessity. Dust rhymed with the light, the work table still tacky from years of sugar and lemon. Her sketchbooks lay in a drawer I never opened. I stood looking at the loop of her N, the fatigue of ink on a long day, the way the last jar label always came out a little more human. Inside a folder stained with something dark and sweet sat the inventory of her seed library. Nora had run it off a shoebox on the porch, envelopes and stamps and a sign that said, "Take 2, leave 1 next time." People left paper clips, foreign coins, one time a poem. Kids who had no seeds drew pictures of seeds and left those. It was the folder that broke me. Names of tomatoes like lullabies. Mortgage lifter. Aunt Ruby's German green. Names of beans that sounded like neighborhoods. Jacob's cattle. Calypso. She had circled some of the ones we had saved together and written, in her half-whisper of a script, good for small hands. The next morning I wore the only sport coat I own, the one with the stain that looks like a country that became independent at last, and sat in a lawyer's office that looked more like a therapist's den. The lawyer had curly hair, a cardigan with elbow patches, and a fern that had opinions. She listened the way people remember. "I am being asked to sign my wife into a bottle," I told her. "We can protect her name, her labels, the hand lettering," she said. "We can record a right of publicity for her name and likeness. But protection is not only fencing. You must decide what you want this to be. If your wife's legacy is a place and not a product, then the owner must be the place." "The place?" I asked, hearing those words like a set of doors. "The place," she said, with a patience that made me believe in the concept. "The garden. A non-profit whose mission is her mission. If that entity owns the marks and the recipes and administers the use, then anyone who wants to use her name would have to serve her values." I remember the precise angle of sunlight on her desk. It fell across a framed photograph of someone's child dressed as a bumblebee. I thought of the time a teenager came to the house with his hoodie up so far he looked like a turtle and left with a bag of basil and a sentence he repeated like a spell, "You did not send me away." "We can do that?" I asked. "We can," she said. "But you will lose things along the way." "I already lost my wife," I said. "The rest is furniture." We worked quietly. We filed for registrations on Nora's name and on the script version of her looping N, traced exactly from a label where she had drawn her breath mid-stroke. We filed to protect the phrase orderly chaos in the categories that mattered. The lawyer introduced me to a notary with bright red nails who told me she cried when her grandmother's recipe became a factory flavor, and in that small confession I found fuel. We established the Lena and Nora Community Kitchen and Garden. Lena was my mother, who believed no child should know powdered eggs. The board was 3 women my wife loved because they had hands that knew where to put themselves. They were, A school librarian with a voice like a kettle that never boils dry, the lead lunch cook from the elementary school, a person who calls every child by their full name as a matter of respect, and Mrs. Rios from next door, who once made arroz con pollo for a boy who had punched her son, because she said nobody should fight on an empty stomach. I signed a deed restriction and a conservation easement that sounded like they were stitched from ugliness, and that is exactly why they work. No demolition. No subdivision. No sale to any for-profit entity. $1 a year lease gave the non-profit the house's kitchen, pantry, and backyard. I recorded the documents at the courthouse where the clerk offered me a peppermint like a benediction. When I told Fiona I wanted to slow down, to read more, to press my ear to the floorboards before we did anything irreversible, she kissed my head and said, "You focus on grieving. I will be a good steward." Steward. That is the word some people use in place of owner, because it sounds more generous. My grandson Ben is 9 and still at the age where he will bind himself to a task with oath-like seriousness. He arrived with a shoebox and a marker and announced that his science project was to study bees. "I need to show them where to go," he said, matter of fact, as if a boy could direct a swarm. We cut arrows from cardstock and tied them with twine, and he planted them by the lavender and rosemary. His hands smelled like water and graphite. "Mom says there will be a ribbon that cuts like a sword," he told me. "She says there will be badges for staff." Badges. I thought of a beehive and how its authority is invisible and absolute. When he left, he slipped me a drawing of a jar with the large loopy N, and in the corner, his letters, "Do not let them change it." It felt like a commission from the smallest board member. The grand opening took place in a former warehouse by the river where the brick had been rubbed raw until it looked like nostalgia. They hung strings of Edison bulbs like constellations. They placed my wife's picture on banners so large she might have run for office. The tasting bar offered tiny spoons like communion, except the jam tasted like a memory drowned in syrup. I tried to take my place along the back wall with the caterers. A boy with a camera told me politely to step aside because he needed heritage. I obliged him. I stood there thinking about poor words that do a lot of work. Heritage. Family-friendly. Legacy. Words that drift far from their anchors. At exactly 6, someone, perhaps in a headset, cued a flourish. The music hiccuped. The projector went black. The little devices at each table paused the stream of their carefully edited story. The screens filled with image from a camera so unflattering it must have told the truth, my face, Nora's shelves behind me, the line of sunlight that always found a jar of honey. I cleared my throat in the recording. "If you are seeing this," I said, "it means someone I love is using my wife's name to sell you something my wife never made." At the back of the room, I could feel the confusion take shape. Guests looked around for the bit, because people expect spectacle at a launch. One man laughed softly as if he had caught the joke first. There are women at the exit with a sign. If you wish to support Nora, you can support the mission she actually had, feeding people, teaching children to cook, keeping this garden a garden. If you are here on business, 2 men in blue jackets will place envelopes in your hands now. On cue, the process servers came through with the efficiency of ushers. They were mild-faced. They said please and thank you. They handed my daughter and her husband cease-and-desist letters that bore the logo of the nonprofit and the traced looping N. A city inspector joined them, his clipboard weighted with ordinances. I had made a call that morning when I realized their temporary permits did not exist because my daughter believed that a hashtag could do city work. The disc jockey tried valiantly to lift the mood, but you cannot dance when your arches have been marked. Dad, Fiona said into the microphone she did not lower, what did you do? The sound carried like weather. Heads turned based on surnames. Family eyes found family. I told the truth, I said, not on the microphone, but it did not matter. In the small sudden silence that follows a public wrong turn, whispers amplify. I watched Fiona pivot. She is our daughter. She knows how to make a platform. She started a speech about honoring her mother and bringing tradition to more people. She said the word success with such gravity you could feel it rearrange priorities. The inspector kept shaking his head no to lines on his page. A toddler cried. An aunt cleared her throat in disapproval and then said both my first and middle name as if doing so might shrink me into someone manageable. The evening did not end so much as lose its edges. The jam sweated under lights. Balloons drooped as if they too were tired of pretending. My son-in-law's face took on a shade I have only seen in men who thought a horse was tame. There was a moment when everyone seemed to be waiting for a script to reappear. It did not. You embarrassed me, Fiona said when she found me by the loading dock. The river made its tireless sound, and somewhere in a distant building an elevator coughed. I looked at my daughter's face and saw her mother's jaw and my stubborn eyes. I preserved your mother, I told her. She laughed the way glass breaks if you push on a corner. Mom would have wanted growth. Growth, I said, is what happens in a garden when you do not step on it. I am your daughter, she said. You chose strangers. I chose a mission, I said. And I chose to put her name where it cannot be pawed. She said, then we are done. The way she said it had none of the drama of a slammed door. It was steady. If a carpenter had said it about a piece of trim, you would admire the measurement. Do not call. Do not come to the house. Ben does not need this theater. I wanted to say this is not theater, the hunger is real. I wanted to tell her the story of the boy who had eaten plain bread every day after school until Nora taught him to scramble eggs. I wanted to hand her the seed library folder and show her where her mother had circled anything that was good for small hands. I did not. I walked home along the river and let the cold do the work that words will not. In the kitchen, I unscrewed the tiny screw that holds keys in a circle and removed the house key. I set it on the table like an offering. The next morning, over coffee that tasted faintly of resignation, I slid the $1 lease across to Mrs. Rios and asked her to never let anyone take it from the neighborhood. We will bolt the door if we have to, she said. And then we will take the hinges off the frame and make a table. That week, the calls began the way summer storms begin in the valley, sudden, humid, with the smell of lightning. Family members who had not said my name in a year said it with more syllables than it has. Text messages arrived that made arguments with themselves. A cousin said we had aired laundry. I said laundry aired by itself after too much neglect. My son-in-law's lawyer sent a letter that overused the word equitable until it meant nothing. I bought a small bound notebook and wrote down each thing that demanded my attention and each thing that deserved it. The first list had many more entries. The marks were examined and published. Someone online called me a gatekeeper, someone else called me a thief. In the morning I taught teenagers to pressure can tomatoes. The hiss of the canner is my new metronome. We practiced safety like a religion. The lunch cook showed them how to listen for the click of a proper seal, how it is a music you learn by repetition and love. We hung a small sign by the garden gate made from a plank that used to be a shelf, orderly chaos this way. In the afternoons, the librarian read aloud from cookbooks as if they were novels. The sentences slowed the room. The boys leaned in, because boys know when something is being taken seriously. Once, an older man sat by the window watching us label jars and cried in the honest way of people who do not perform it. He told us he was sorry. He did not specify what for. We gave him a jar of peaches because no apology should leave empty-handed. On a day when the first heat pushed everything into a waiver, Ben's class came on a field trip. I stood with my hands behind my back as if they belonged to someone restrained. His teacher taught the children the word pollinator. She gave each child a packet of seeds from the library. Ben asked for peas. He did not look at me when he took the envelope, and that obedience to his mother's direction was its own kind of love. When his class reached the gate, he turned as if the idea had tugged him. He walked back with the solemnity of a boy who has decided not to cry. He did not step into my arms. He did not say Grandpa. He took a pencil from the jar near the sign-in sheet and printed on the back of the envelope in careful letters, "Keep it the same." He placed the envelope on my shoe and left, his head high in that way a child's head is when their neck is learning to carry more than a face. If you ask me what hurts the most, I will tell you it is not the public scene. It is not the phone calls or the letters with long words arranged like barricades. It is the evenings when I go to the studio to close the window Nora always left open a crack, and I have to resist the impulse to call my daughter and tell her the way the light fell across the dill, because it looked like water and I know she loves water. It is remembering the day Fiona refused the boiled carrots I made because they were too soft, and Nora took her hand and said, "We do not insult food," and Fiona, small and stubborn, chewed with tears in her eyes because she could obey a principle even when she did not like it. There are small moments that keep me from bitterness. The time a teenager washed the big pot without being told and dried it with the last clean towel, and I heard in the scrape of cloth against metal all of my wife's instruction echoing through hands that never knew her. The woman who brought a cake that tasted exactly like February sunlight. The boy who spelled coriander with 2 R's and 3 E's and did not seem at all sorry. I am not naive. I know what story is being told at other tables. In that story, I am rigid, controlling, incapable of seeing a bigger picture. In that story, heritage means multiplying, and love means licensing. In my story, which is the one I must live, love means saying no in a tone that can be mistaken for cruelty. It means fences whose ugliness protects the meadow. It means hearing my own name hissed and letting it be. It means becoming the villain on purpose because the role of saint was never available to men like me. When the garden sleeps, the neighborhood gets louder in a good way. Laughter travels through the alleys. Pots clatter. Somebody burns onions and starts again. The kitchen light spills across the porch like it did when Nora stayed up with teenagers who could not go home yet. Some nights I make her lemon sponge cake in a pan she refused to replace, and it rises like a small miracle. I slice it and leave it cooling with a note that says, "Take 2 if you are sad." I do not sign the note. The handwriting would give me away. Sometimes, a child I do not know draws an N with a loop bigger than the jar and tapes it to the refrigerator. The tape always peels paint when we remove it later, and I leave the torn edge as a record. Some days, cars I recognize slow in front of the house and do not stop. That is part of the cost. The rest of the cost is quiet. This is how it ends for us, at least for now, the legacy intact, the family diminished to one boy who writes instructions on the back of an envelope and a man who treasures a handwriting that can no longer change. I protected her name. I kept the garden a garden. I steadied the recipes like a shelf. I lost my daughter. It is both everything and not enough. It is the only ending that keeps faith with the woman who taught me that some things do not scale and some lines, once drawn, must hold.
Hello everyone, and thank you for watching. I truly hope you enjoyed listening to this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel to help support the creation of more stories like this. Have a great day or evening.